All right, let's dive into a topic that's been debated for, well, centuries: hell. In this explainer, we're going to break down one very specific theological perspective: what it is, why it exists, and who it's for, with every single detail pulled directly from our source material. So let's start with a claim from our source that might just surprise you, and it's this. Right now, hell, the final place of eternal punishment, is actually empty. No one is there. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, right? But to understand this view, we've got to get clear on two key locations that often get mixed up. So first things first, we've got to get our terms straight. According to this perspective, the Bible actually talks about two very different places for the unsaved after they die. There's a temporary waiting room, and then there's the final permanent destination. Now, the timing here is absolutely critical. The source points directly to this verse from Revelation. You see the argument? It says Hades itself gets thrown into the lake of fire, but only at the final judgment, like at the very end of everything. This is the key piece of evidence for their idea that hell is currently uninhabited. Okay, so that leads to the obvious question, right? If they're not in hell, where are the souls of the unsaved right now? Well, the answer our source gives is a place called Hades. So here's the crucial distinction you have to get. Think of Hades as a temporary holding cell, okay? It's a place where the unsaved are waiting for their final sentence. Hell, which this source calls the lake of fire, that's the permanent prison. That's the final stop. And what's this holding cell like? Well, the source pulls its description from the story of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke. And according to that story, it's not pleasant. It's described as a place of conscious torment in flames, where people fully remember their past lives and from which there is absolutely no way out. This brings us to another really fascinating idea from the source material: the possibility that punishment in the afterlife, well, it might not be a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. The source highlights passages like this one, where Jesus seems to suggest that there's a kind of hierarchy of judgment. He's saying that for some infamously wicked ancient cities, Judgment Day will be more tolerable, easier, than for the towns that saw his miracles firsthand and still rejected him. And this idea gets laid out even more clearly in another one of Jesus' parables. Here, he directly connects how severe the punishment is to how much a person knew. If you knew what was right and didn't do it, the punishment is harsher than for someone who just acted out of ignorance. So you see the principle, right? It's pretty straightforward. More knowledge, more accountability. Well, according to this view, that leads to a more severe judgment. It suggests a system where the punishment actually fits the crime. Now, it is really important to be clear about this. The source itself calls this idea of degrees of punishment speculation. It's an interpretation of these verses. But what it presents as an absolute certainty is the nature of the punishment itself, that it is eternal, that it is conscious, and that there is no rest. Okay, so all of this brings us to the big theological question: why? According to this framework, why does a place like hell have to exist at all? What's its purpose? The whole argument really rests on this one concept: the wages of sin is death. And the source is quick to point out we're not just talking about physical death. It's what the Bible calls the second death, an eternal separation from God in the lake of fire. That's the payment that's earned for doing wrong. So the logic kind of follows from there. If God is perfectly just, perfectly holy, then he can't just ignore sin. He can't just sweep it under the rug. In this view, every single wrong act, no matter how small it might seem to us, it all has to be accounted for by a righteous judge. And this punishment is described as an expression of God's wrath. Now, the source clarifies that this isn't some petty, out-of-control temper tantrum. It's framed as an active, just, and holy anger against sin for messing up creation and defying God. And this is often the biggest hurdle for people. A sin that happens in a finite amount of time on earth gets an infinite eternal punishment? Why does this theology say it has to be forever? Well, the explanation that's offered is all about a sort of cosmic balancing of the scales. The argument goes like this: God offered a solution that has infinite value, the life of his son, Jesus. So if you reject a payment of infinite worth, you logically end up with a debt of infinite consequence. But look, the narrative presented in our source doesn't just end with punishment. After detailing this whole system of divine justice, it spends a good amount of time on what it calls the path to mercy, the escape hatch. And at the core of this escape plan is this verse, probably one of the most famous verses in the entire Bible. It frames the choice perfectly. It's not just about damnation, it's a choice between perishing, on the one hand, and having everlasting life through belief on the other.
And this gets to the concept of substitution. The source explains that because Jesus lived a perfect, sinless life, he could voluntarily step in and take the punishment, the full force of God's wrath against sin that everyone else deserved. His death on the cross is seen as the payment for that entire debt.
So, how does a person actually get on this escape road? The source lays out a very clear two-step process. First, you have to acknowledge in your own heart that you're a sinner who deserves that punishment. And second, you have to believe, to trust, that Jesus' sacrifice was enough to pay for it all. And while that choice is presented as being simple, the source ends with a pretty sobering warning from Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. The idea is that even though the path to life is available to everyone, the broad road that leads to destruction, that's the one many people will end up choosing.
So, to do a super quick recap of the main points from our source material, we've covered the difference between Hades and hell, the speculative idea that punishment might have different degrees, the theological why behind hell's existence as an act of justice, and finally, the path of mercy offered as an escape.
And all of that brings us to our final thought. When you take this specific framework, one that holds these huge concepts of eternal punishment, divine wrath, and infinite mercy all in tension together, it raises a really powerful question. How does believing all of this at once actually shape a person's view of justice, their purpose in life, and how they relate to the people around them? That's something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.